They think that the country that they rather want, has come into being during the Second World War, a country that is much more open about its Christianity, that is much more respectful of its military, that is much more united. And all of a sudden, they see, well, maybe that wasn't the case after all.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. During World War II, as Britain was fighting not only for survival but for its imperial future, political thinking did not stop. Likewise in Australia, Robert Menzies, who'd recently resigned as Prime Minister, began that long process of intellectual reflection that would culminate in the founding of the Liberal Party in 1944 and the enunciation of his post-war vision of a free, prosperous and democratic Australia. In Britain, the Conservatives were engaged in their own ideological project, one far more radical and utopian than we often assume. Rather than simply defending the status quo, Winston Churchill and his colleagues used the war to imagine a rejuvenated British Empire, anchored in a Christian morality, martial virtue and imperial unity. This was far from being a merely reactionary agenda. This was a conservatism animated by bold dreams of a civilisational renewal. And it offers a fascinating counterpoint to the liberalism that Robert Menzies and others in Australia would go on to champion in the post-war decades. Joining me to discuss British conservatism during the Second World War is author and historian Dr. Kit Kowol. Lovely to have you on Afternoon Light, Kit.
Oh, lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure, Kit. And Kit, you wrote this book, Blue Jerusalem, British Conservatism, Winston Churchill and the Second World War. It came out in 2024 and it's a provocative title. I'd say most of our listeners are more familiar with Australian conservative thought and liberal thought and Australian political history of the era, so perhaps don't automatically understand the allusion when you use Blue Jerusalem. Can you talk about why you chose this title? Why is it so rich in symbolism?
Well, I chose the title because I'm a sucker for things that attempt to be cunning and punning. Probably came up with the title before I got the content of the book, but it references this idea that the Labour Party, Britain's kind of left-wing socialist party at the time, were interested in building what they called a new Jerusalem. And that itself is a reference to William Blake and to that incredible hymn that I'm sure you've had to suffer through at the start of cricket matches in which the England and Wales team are playing, which talks about building a new Jerusalem in Britain's green and pleasant land. So Labour talked about this idea of kind of building a whole new society, a more democratic, popular, socialistic society. And I'm talking about the Tory alternative to it, the Tories' traditional colour being blue. So that's the basis of the pun Blue Jerusalem, this alternative, radical Tory vision of the future, which, alas, was never realised.
Well, no, of course, we'll get on to this later, but Winston Churchill loses the 1945 election, so that's the end of a conservative, post-war conservative government, if there was to be one. The academic sort of scholarly attention has been on, I guess, what happened rather than what might have been, and that's why your book is so fascinating and novel. But the intellectual debates and policy development and development of political ideas during World War II. I mean, the attention's been on Labor, British Labor, but I mean, would you say that's because it was incredibly dynamic, or is it just because they got in 45 and it implemented it and therefore people are just more interested in what happened than what didn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of both, but it's more of the case that people are interested in, why Britain ended up with the mixed market, welfare state, government-regulated economy that the Attlee government, Clement Attlee's government in 1945 created. And the story, because the Labour Party wins such a massive majority in 1945, the story has all to date really been about, where did that come from? How did it happen? I think in history, there's sometimes a tendency towards kind of seeing things as inevitable and reducing or removing some of the complexity and contingency. And that was what I was trying to, put back into the story, to say that there were other futures available. There were different ways of imagining post-war Britain and also the post-war world very different to Labour. And that these didn't happen, they were perhaps less likely to happen than others, but they were out there. And in many ways, the desire for them shaped the politics of the Second World War itself. Because, of course, it was the Conservative Party who, during the Second World War, though in coalition with Labour, was definitely the stronger partner in many ways. And they always had an eye to the future. And that eye to the future influenced how they fought the war, the policies that they undertook, the places where they fought, what type of material they fought with, etc. So to understand the story of how we get to the Labour Party victory, you can't just omit one side. And it's putting it back in. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, fascinating. I mean, you've migrated to Australia now. You're here, and you're no doubt, as a historian, learning about Australia's political history. It's fascinating to see how Australia in World War II, with the development of political ideas on the centre-right by Robert Menzies and others, and that obviously manifested in the founding of a new political party, in the Liberal Party. With the election of that Liberal Party in 1949, we went on a completely different pathway than Britain in terms of, real renunciation of nationalisation, a much more limited welfare state, a real emphasis on private home ownership rather than government-funded and owned homes. It's such a divergence in the pathways and trajectories of these two countries, which culturally, obviously historically, institutionally share so very much. And so while the British Conservative Party's political ideas that were developing during World War II are actually quite different from the ones that Robert Menzies was developing, there is a really, I think, clear example of where you end up when you implement those two contrasting visions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this was one of the first things that really struck me when I moved to Australia and learned about things like, there is an insurance system for health. You have to pay, do you know what, it's pretty good. You have to pay in a little bit of money. The government carries some. Private health is subsidised. There's such thing as kind of government support for private schools. And I started looking at all these things and starting to think, well, do you know what? It's not a million miles away from what some Conservatives were wanting to do during the Second World War. And it is absolutely fascinating how political life can be so different as a result of these momentous elections in the past that still kind of shape the way that the two countries behave and act. No one's bowing down, waving flags to Medicare in Australia in the way that they do in the UK, literal flags waving in people's windows.
No one is waving flags to Medicare, although it's a really powerful campaign tool. I mean, we've just seen in the recent federal election here in Australia, the Labor government campaigned very hard on Medicare and announced policies around Medicare and that they would protect Medicare, and the opposition Liberals would basically scrap Medicare or defund Medicare. And that is still a really potent political issue. But yes, it's not like in COVID we were standing outside clapping NHS or Medicare workers. We don't have that kind of almost sort of religious attachment to our health service like I think the UK does.
Yeah. I mean, in part because it is one of the last remaining legacies of that post-45 Labour government, the promise of universalism that Labour put in place after the Second World War. So much of the architecture of that around very strong unions, around nationalised industries have disappeared. What remains is this commitment to the National Health Service.
Yeah. So tell me about the nature of the Conservative Party at the beginning of World War II, obviously led by Neville Chamberlain. What were its political ideas, its standpoint? How was it dealing with the prospect of war as a Conservative Party and a Conservative government?
Well, in many ways, it was quite modern, in its own mind, modern, progressive Conservative government. One of the great fallacies about British history is that Labour introduces the welfare state in 1945. I mean, actually, there'd been quite a range of social services that had been introduced by Liberals in the early part of the 20th century, but also very much built upon by the Tories in the 20s and 30s. It was quite modern in its approach to the economy. It was happy to have some government intervention where it was seen as being necessary and useful, like having government-owned electricity distribution, but also very kind of keen on private enterprise at the same time. And its general kind of themes or underlying structures were, very much a focus on the nation, on patriotism, on support for the empire. And it liked to think of itself as a party that represented common sense, as opposed to what it was arguing that the Labour Party was interested in, which was ideology above all else, and particularly foreign ideology as opposed to kind of practical, common sense, decent English way of doing things.
British, yes.
Yes. British, but also English. It was like, in very ways, it kind of stressed Englishness, particularly under Stanley Baldwin, and presented an image of the country that was in many ways kind of gentle, pastoral, rather less kind of tub-thumpy and jingoistic than British conservatism in the Edwardian period.
How did conceptions, though, of empire fit into that kind of pastoral, I guess, simplistic, very much focused on England and the simple life and not these sort of wild foreign ideas like, communism, socialism and decolonisation?
Well, it was interesting, like the way that the empire was kind of reimagined by many conservatives in the 30s as being less of a empire that being forged through conflict as to one that was an empire much more focused on common bonds, common ideals. And the story was very much Britain was the mother country, and the empire, and particularly thinking here of the predominantly white dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, were thought of as the daughters of empire, that Britain was, allowing to, in some ways, run free, cutting the apron strings. And there was a genuine kind of celebration of that. And of course, the empire is itself seen as quite a modern thing, rather than, as we think of it, a kind of backwards form of political organisation. I mean, the future of the world was seen in terms of like competing empires, and the British Empire was the most advanced and developed, and it was helping people along the path towards self-government. So it was an optimistic, quite progressive story.
As Britain lurches and, obviously doesn't want to through the appeasement strategy of Chamberlain, but lurches towards war, how is the Conservative Party dealing with that?
Well, almost all Conservatives are very, very well aware of what war would do to Britain and its empire in particular. Wars are, hugely expensive, hugely disruptive. You look at what had happened to European countries after the First World War, the revolutions during the war and then afterwards in Russia and Germany, the political strife in France, what's happening in Spain, etc. And there is a real fear that the war could unleash forces that would be impossible to constrain, whether that's through in the empire and growing nationalist movements, or whether it's kind of social change in Britain and the kind of social class structure and the hierarchies that Conservatives, many of which to kind of defend and maintain, would be under threat. Because we know what the Second World War was like, but obviously Tories at the time didn't. They could only use their imaginations and past experience, and they imagined a war very much like the First World War, with huge amounts of death and destruction, but probably worse. The terror of the bomber and what that might do to civilian morale, riots on the streets, looting, etc., complete kind of mental and social collapse. So they were desperate to try and avoid that at almost any cost.
And when the war inevitably started, how did Chamberlain himself react to the outbreak? I mean, it was quite a sort of strange reaction, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Chamberlain is bitterly, bitterly disappointed. He has made his name as a peacemaker. Munich, at the time, the Munich settlement had been seen as hugely popular in Britain. And he thought that his political career had been a colossal failure as a result of this. And he goes into something of a spiral, but pretty deep depression. He can be quite defeatist at moments, actually. And he's also worried about his own political career. Like, he's aware that he's a very good politician in times of peace, but he thinks maybe I don't have the chops for war, and actually maybe other people realise that too. So he's very, very downcast.
What about him trying to explain to the public what the aims are of this war? I mean, the British ambassador in Berlin hands the German government that final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock and they were prepared to withdraw their troops from Poland, then a state of war would exist between us. And they didn't withdraw their troops, and so a state of war existed. And Robert Menzies down in Australia says, well, Britain is at war with Germany, so Australia is at war with Germany. But Chamberlain as Prime Minister, did he need to justify this war to the public and be explicit about the aims of what Britain was trying to achieve? Or was
that's certainly what a lot of people wanted. Because it's actually really difficult for Chamberlain in 1939 to say, 1709-39, what this war is for like very good diplomatic reasons, because he's got to think about, well, if I say it's like a war for democracy, how's that going to play with the Italians? It might sound great to the Americans, but it might sound terrible to Mussolini. Is this a war for Christian civilization, which might sound great to the Italians, but would probably sound terrible to others, the Russians, who you might want to get on side at some point. And things are changing dramatically. The war is progressing very, very fast. So even when they try and come up with a list of, what Britain wants positively, they have difficulty. But nonetheless, there is this great clamour, much of it incidentally coming from the Dominions, to give a positive case for the war. And Chamberlain, for those kind of strategic diplomatic reasons, has great difficulty articulating it, which puts him in a very awkward position, because other people, politics, wars of acumen, other people kind of push in with their ideas of what the war should be for, whether that's a war to get rid of all wars and create a kind of federal precursor to the United Nations, a kind of world government, or if it's to destroy Germany, which Chamberlain's a bit worried about saying that's a good idea, because he actually kind of wants there to be a German uprising and wants the kind of German general staff on his side. So he's really hamstrung, he's stymied, he can't articulate a positive case.
Tell me about the nature of the ousting of Chamberlain. I mean, he's having difficulty really trying to justify the war and articulate the war aims. And Robert Menzies in Australia has exactly the same issue and finds it very difficult to be too elaborate or too concrete about what Australia is going to achieve in this war. But how does Chamberlain end up resigning in 1940?
Well, it's a revolt on the right. That's what really does it for him. So it's a revolt within the Conservative Party, because there are people within the Conservative Party who want a much more forceful prosecution of the war. Because Chamberlain's strategy was to kind of hope that there would be a collapse in Germany, a collapse in either German morale or in the German economy, that there'd be some kind of uprising against Hitler. And so he'd been very, very careful about offensive action. He didn't want to play into German hands. He didn't want to bomb Germany and perhaps get the German population all riled up and on Hitler's side. I mean, there's even fear about what would happen if they set some of the woods in Bavaria on fire. Would this be seen as like too inflammatory a thing to do? So there'd been a deliberate kind of holding back. And there are others in the Conservative Party who are very annoyed by this strategy, who want a much more forceful prosecution of the war, want offensive action, want attacks across the seas. And eventually a head of steam builds up, a number of different disparate groups come together. And the point that really does for Chamberlain is when he does try a bit of offensive action, when there is the campaign to try and preempt the Germans getting into Norway, which turns into a bit of a disaster, really. The Brits and the Empire forces are kicked out of Norway rather quickly. And then there's this remarkable parliamentary debate, one of those moments when really the fate of a prime minister, some would say the fate of a country, really does come down to words spoken in the chamber of the House of Commons. One of those moments is when a Tory MP stands up. He'd previously been in the Navy, and he turns up and he's in his kind of full military admiral's outfit, covered in medals, and says that he's speaking on behalf of the fighting men and women. And this causes an eruption in many ways. And really that kind of intangible mood, sentiment really goes against Chamberlain, and he's forced to try and reconstitute his government. He wants to bolster his support to get the Labour Party on side, but they say, look, we're not going to work with you. Because Chamberlain had been, in many ways, a kind of good political dogfighter. He'd been like a very strong anti-Labour man, and the Labour Party didn't want to have anything to do with him. So faced with that, it's, right, you've got to go, we've got to find someone else.
And Labour choose Churchill.
Yeah. I mean, in part because Churchill isn't actually desperately liked within the Conservative Party. When he becomes Prime Minister, he turns up at the House of Commons, and the first cheer is not for him, it's for Chamberlain. He's someone who is distrusted among the Conservative benches for good reasons. You know, he'd been a Conservative once, and then he left for the Liberal Party, and then he left the Liberal Party to go back to the Conservatives. So he's seen as someone who kind of ratted and then re-ratted, as the term goes. And is someone who's had terrible political judgment in the past, whether it was his opposition to some of the reforms on India or whether it was over the abdication of support for Edward VIII. He's been on, in some ways, the wrong side of history, it seems like, for the last 20 years. He's also a big drinker, and he's thought of as a kind of wild and erratic man. Many Tories can't stand Churchill. And those first few weeks are really quite dicey for him. And he ends up actually really relying on Neville Chamberlain to protect his right flank.
Where did Churchill then ideologically sit in the Conservative Party?
So, I mean, this is a fantastic question, and one that's so hard to get to. So, in many ways, he's an aristocratic paternalist. He does believe that people like him and Aristos know best, but he has this kind of sense of noblesse oblige.
Yeah, noblesse oblige. Yeah.
And so you could say that's kind of his Tory roots, but he also has kind of reforming liberal ones. He's a great free trader. One of the reasons why a lot of Conservatives distrusted him. And he, as a liberal, had been very much involved in some of the early welfare reforms. So he's got this kind of split Tory liberal personality, which he very cleverly chooses to emphasise one element at one point and another at a different one, depending on what audience or political situation he is in. Of course, central to all of this, though, is he's an absolute diehard empire man. One of many Conservatives, a lot of British people who just really can't conceive of Britain without the British Empire, like they're one and the same. And that desire to protect the empire goes all the way through his political career.
Was he, he's sort of described as pretty militaristic, isn't he? I mean, very, very quick to want to fight, to go to war. I mean, is that a fair characterisation of him?
Look, I think he's always been interested in military affairs, fascinated by the services. Lots of stories of him as a boy, kind of playing with model soldiers. He's fascinated by his ancestor, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. Loves dressing up in the outfits of military men. Of course, was a soldier himself and loves the dash and the flair of that. And yeah, he is someone who has great fun scheming military operations and coming up with kind of daring ideas to break the status quo. So famously, as you would know, in Gallipoli. At the same time, he is a man who's willing to have people who disagree around him. And it's always said, like, Churchill chucks out 10 ideas a day, 9 of them might be terrible, 1 might be good. But the great thing is that he's willing to have people around him to have those arguments to sort out the good from the bad.
And did his views encapsulate a particular ideological faction within the Conservative Party, do you think? Or was his leadership role in that national government during World War II really one that rose above the Conservative Party debates?
Yeah, so I think it's probably the latter, and that's a deliberate thing on his part. He doesn't want to get identified too much with one faction or another. And also when it comes to domestic politics, he knows that his position rests on being part of this coalition that he's the centre of, with the Conservatives, with the Labour Party, with the Liberal Party. And so he doesn't actually want to court party political controversy between them. So he tries as best as he can to say, look, let's fight the war. We'll all agree on how to do it. And when we know if we're going to win, or once we've won, then we can go to what the post-war period is all like. So he deliberately tries to kind of step above the fray on those sort of things. Gets dragged into it from time to time. But the great thing is that then opens up a lot of space for other people to try and impose their ideas.
So who were these other people and what were their I guess, groups of ideas? I mean, it was pretty factionalised, wasn't it, the Conservative Party?
Yeah, so we're not talking like Australian-style factions. People aren't kind of holding different membership cards and things like that. But there are kind of distinct groupings of people, of MPs and journalists and thinkers and leaders who associate more with one group of people than another. I mean, in many ways, they kind of represent different, not just strands of opinion, but also different interests within the Conservative Party. So there are your kind of diehard imperialist protection people who very much orbit around Leo Amery, who during the Second World War was Secretary of State for India and Burma. Then there are people kind of more associated with those new, modern, successful industries of the 1930s, like chemicals and car manufacturing, who are very interested in sort of trying to run the country almost like a corporation and trying to stitch up deals between business leaders on different sides of the world who are probably a bit more Atlanticist than their kind of imperialist colleagues. Then you have people who come from Britain's kind of financial service sector economy who are more libertarian, we might call them these days. They call themselves individualists, and they're very much about small government, free trade. They think the 19th century Gladstonian finance was what made Britain great, so let's have a bit more of that. And then a whole kind of range of other Tory groupings, from kind of people who were in very ways kind of reactionary aristocrats who want to turn the clock back, some of them to kind of medieval period, to others who really focused on kind of religious revival.
The religious revival element of conservative ideology and ideological, differences is a fascinating one. And I mean, it manifests in some quite interesting policies too that, live with you to this day in Britain. The Church of England schools become sort of part of the state school system, don't they? I mean, this is, for an Australian, seems an anathema. Our state school system is so sort of avowedly secular.
Yeah, and this was, it's something that a lot of Tories had wanted for a long time, to have explicit state support for Anglican Church of England schools, but had never been able to get it off the ground because of debates with Catholics and kind of non-conformists. I don't want to pay our taxes to have you fund, views we don't agree with. And the Tories do use the situation of the war to push their ideas through, most famously with a guy called R.A. Rab Butler, who after the war is thought of as very much a kind of consensus moderate figure. He writes a book called Politics of the Art of the Possible, but really during the war is very much a kind of radical thinker. And he's talking about creating a new Christian civilization in Britain, with education really being the kind of the powerful driver behind it, trying to create a generation of new Christian leaders who would be able to stand up to the powers of and temptations of totalitarianism.
How important were these views within the Conservative Party, or were they sort of somewhat sidelined?
So those kind of Christian views and the idea that this is a cataclysmic event. It is, it almost seems like world-ending, apocalyptic, and the sense that Britain needed to restore its Christian nature was something that was actually very widely felt across the Conservative Party. And that's one of the reasons why education reform is something that is pushed and is successful during the war, because it was one of the things that they could agree on, as opposed to things like industrial policy, where there are big debates. So it is very important, and it does build upon it, like a genuine reattachment to faith that happened in Britain during the Second World War. So in some ways, they are working with the flow of opinion.
It's interesting, though, because it stands in quite stark contrast to Labor's position, which is incredibly secular, linked to the socialist agenda.
Yeah, of course, like the Labour Party also, has some of its roots in Methodism. The famous essay question when I was at university, and indeed when my parents were at university, was the question of, does Labour owe more to Methodism than it does to Marxism? So there was a kind of Christian socialist element within the Labour Party. The very fact that they are referring to building a new Jerusalem, which has a kind of biblical root, speaks to that. But for those on the left, when it comes to religion, the focus is less on education and creating a kind of Christian populace and a Christian kind of political and military elite, than it is about taking Christian values, embedding them in things like welfare.
One of the other really interesting, I think, ideological splits, and I'm not sure if it's so much within the Conservative Party as outside of it, and then in contrast with its own opinions around the status of everyday civilians, the everyday people, and how they were part of the war effort versus the status of soldiers and military people, and that they were considered elevated, that this was a war being fought by the soldiers, and you should, provide them with welfare when they return, but maybe disregarding the everyday sacrifices of those on the home front.
Yeah, so I mean, and this is one of the big themes of the book, is that the Second World War is thought of in many ways retrospectively as a people's war, of a war that was fought by the people, kind of especially for the people. And that was a story that was told during the Second World War and was embraced, the sense that the person on the home front was as important as the person on the battlefront, that you were making as much contribution building a tank as you were driving one, and particularly that the labour movement was really important to the war. And that is contrasted with a way of thinking about the war, which is in some ways a bit more traditional, focus upon this war being fought by the kind of armed forces, with a particular focus on kind of the elite within the armed forces and the aristocrats, predominantly, or middle and upper middle class officers who are directing things. And of course, those are two deeply political stories, because depending on who you think won the war, you'll come up with different answers about what you should get as a result and where the war dividends should go.
Leading up to the 1945 election, of course, Kit, it's one that Churchill loses, and loses pretty badly. What was the platform that Churchill and the Conservatives took in response to the very radical Labor platform of Attlee?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the most interesting things is that the Conservative Party doesn't technically really have much of a platform. The manifesto doesn't contain the word Conservative. It's Mr. Churchill's declaration to the electors. And the focus of the campaign is very much upon Churchill, the war winner, Churchill, the leader of a united country. The Conservatives are wanting to be seen as part of a national effort rather than a particular party partisan one. And Churchill's Conservative manifesto, and if we call it that, is quite light on policy detail, partly because of those divides within the party that we talked about. So while it does kind of pay lip service to some of the more radical proposals that kind of Labour are in favour of, so for example, Keynesian economics and the government guaranteeing employment, or the more developed, more universal welfare system and healthcare system that are kind of promoted as a result of the Beveridge report, the language around it is very careful. Like, it's always couched with, yeah, but kind of if we can afford it or when the time's right. So it's a quite cautious, policy-light manifesto, very much saying, like, vote for Churchill and finish the war against Japan. Hey, this war isn't actually over, as opposed to going down an untrusted path with Labour in hock to their kind of foreign ideas, etc.
But, I mean, evidently the British public decided they prefer the Labor approach to Churchill's platform or manifesto. I mean, for Conservatives, this must have been devastating, of course. I mean, their leader has been in charge of the war and, Britain is looking like it will win it. I mean, it's clear they're going to win it. They just need to finally finish it. And that's the thanks you get. I mean, is there a devastation in the Conservative Party?
I mean, there absolutely is. And I mean, one of the most fun bits of research that I did for the book was looking at the letters that were written to Churchill from members of the public and Tory members after the Second World War. And they are, I found them by a surprise, because I found this box of letters called condolences. And I thought it related to some kind of death. And in many ways, they were condolence letters. They were letters from men and women saying, yeah, we can't believe that the people have betrayed you like this, that they've betrayed the sacrifices that were made during the war, that they've betrayed the empire by voting for Labour. And people talk about, hearing the results and bursting into tears. It really is a great emotional shock, because for a lot of Conservatives, in some ways, they think that the country that they rather want has come into being during the Second World War, a country that is much more open about its Christianity, that is much more respectful of its military, that is much more united. And all of a sudden, they see, well, maybe that wasn't the case after all. Because they voted for this political party that, in many Conservatives' minds, cannot be trusted and is in some ways like dangerously totalitarian, potentially.
So they're in opposition from 1945 to 51, if I've got my figures right.
Yeah, you have.
And they win in 51. So I mean, what sort of reflection do Churchill and the Conservatives go through during this period? Do they look at leaders like Robert Menzies, who's undertaking what we call in Australia a liberal revival, but very much a lot of hard work in sort of the intellectual foundations of that centre-right philosophy, and really seeing, I think, investing in what is the future, where is this country going, and how are we going to get it there? Like, what are the values we want to promote for this country to make it a democracy and prosperous and free?
Yeah, so I mean, they do quite a lot of explicit ideological work and intellectual thinking, much of it led by the guy I mentioned before, Rab Butler. And there's kind of two ways to see what happens. You can either say that the Conservative Party come to power because they change dramatically, because they embrace the kind of Labour settlement that was put into place in 1945, that they say, yes, okay, we believe in a large degree of public ownership to guarantee employment. Yes, we believe in a universal healthcare system. So you can say that. Or you could actually say, look, in many ways, they actually just go back to the kind of conservatism that people like Baldwin, people like Chamberlain, who were quite progressive conservatives in their own right, were advocating back in the 1930s. I've been working on this question for 15, 20 years. I still haven't entirely made up my mind. But of course, they're very much influenced by external events. And this is also the era when the Cold War is heating up. And as well as saying, yes, we accept the welfare state as it is, and yes, we accept some nationalisation, they also make a very clear point of saying, but we're in favour of private enterprise, we're in favour of freedom, and they're able to play that kind of patriotic defence card much more strongly in 51 than they had been during the Second World War, when they tried to cast Labour as being unpatriotic but couldn't really succeed because Labour had been in the war effort.
Yeah, being part of the national government, of course. Yeah. Do you see parallels, I mean, having lived in Australia for a bit now, Kit, between the Blue Jerusalem Conservatives you write about and Robert Menzies and his Liberals in the 1940s?
I mean, there's a little bit here and there. I think I probably see in some ways the most obvious parallels are kind of for people before Menzies, like sort of Deaconites and some of the protectionist elements within Australian political life in the early part of the 20th century. And there's definitely that strand that exists within the Conservative Party during the war. There is that more, more gentle, more moderate, more liberal element within the party too, that, we could perhaps say has some connection to Menzies. But I'm afraid to say that British Tories don't actually think an awful lot about Australia in the 1940s and 1950s, in contrast to today, when actually, rather than New Jerusalem, Australia, particularly for Boris Johnson and a lot of Tories around him, Australia was seen as the promised land and what they wanted to recreate in Britain. And in some ways, I think that speaks to the kind of the great change in British conservatism, that, those more, you might say, kind of authoritarian elements that people were worried about authority more than liberty, who are very invested in the maintenance of the church and the aristocracy, who are quite sceptical about democracy, quite sceptical about private enterprise, and kind of grubby, ghastly middle-class manufacturing upstarts, that really does disappear over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And the British Conservative Party and the Australian Liberal Party are much, much more similar beasts in 2025 than they were in 1945.
It's fascinating to hear that because, of course, for Australians in the 1940s, Britain was a sort of an animating principle. I mean, there was a lot that was quite derivative of Britain, but I mean, the same can be said of the United States. Australians spend a lot of time thinking about the United States, about what's going on there politically, culturally, and all in the middle, and obviously economically, militarily, and yet it's not necessarily reciprocated, which is not necessarily a problem. I mean, Australians think of things from an Australian perspective. So if they think about a country that's not thinking about them, that doesn't necessarily affect our well-being. But when you see how Robert Menzies is thinking about his political ideas, I mean, he corresponds a lot with Leo Amory, who, is a very sort of important figure in Conservative Party, and of course has an important role in bringing down Chamberlain. So, and his relationship with Churchill, of course, is well known. So it's fascinating. And there's all the rumours, for example, that Menzies might have been a British Prime Minister if things might have gone, differently. So it's fascinating then to think that perhaps we weren't so key in sort of political discussions in the Conservative Party.
And you're right, amongst those more imperialist-minded Tories, there was, because of their connections, there was a much more interest in what was going on in the empire. They were often, though, quite disappointed in the empire at the same time. They were deeply imperial-minded, and they met people like Menzies who were imperial-minded, but they couldn't quite grasp the sense of kind of national ambition that existed in places like Australia and Canada. And they were desperate for a more kind of united empire. And in some ways, they blamed the colonies for not rising together, probably foolishly.
Do you think there's much left of these Blue Jerusalem ideas in the modern day Conservative Party? And I appreciate it's at a bit of a low point these days.
Yeah, I think so. When I started writing about the book, which was an awfully long time ago, it took me twice as long to write as the Second World War took to fight. I was very, very down on the level of intellectual engagement within the Conservative Party. It seemed to exist on a diet almost exclusively of kind of reheated, watered down Thatcherism. I think, interestingly, in some ways, there are the distinct echoes in the party at the moment of some of the ideas that I was discovering and talking about in the book. So this kind of like Anglo-futurism and the idea of creating a more technology advanced, progressive nation is something that's rearing its head in the UK. Discussions about, some people call it Empire 2.0 post-Brexit, but kind of ANZUCAS and a kind of English-speaking union and a greater kind of Anglo union, those ideas have kind of popped back up. And I think in the best parts of the Conservative Party, there is much more of a willingness to think more broadly and strategically and long term about the future, which is in some ways, very refreshing to me. And I hope that there is space to say, look, you can look back. There were predecessors. The Conservative Party did at one time think this way and was open to radical ideas.
Yeah, well, what a fascinating book. And your research, I know, has been widely praised. I read Lord Roberts even praising your book and, as a perfect example of revisionist history. So well done, Kit. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.